Thank you. I will need to present in English. I'm studying Estonian, but only one course done so far. My presentation is based on my project during the past 20 years as practicing architect and researcher and teacher, first at Aalto University, then in Umeå School of Architecture, Sweden, and now in TalTech. I'm talking about experiences in integrating renewable energies in the built environment. The projects that I'm going to show you are basically guided by some regional constraints, like national subsidies for certain energy sources, availability of certain products and systems, and then my involvement in the development projects that have been testing and developing something new in the Finnish environment. The idea of nearly zero energy buildings was first introduced as a target to build zero energy buildings, and later on in political decision making that was changed a bit, but this quote expresses quite well the excitement that has been supporting the development of nearly zero energy buildings and zero energy buildings. However, I believe that this statement here introduces no long-term solutions for problems in sustainability or energy maintenance. It is rather my experience that mostly the good places for homes and habitats are not the same places where the conditions are optimum for energy production. However, this is something that is happening already, and maybe another crystallization of this development is this Kraftwerk Gottes, Austrian church, which is a plus energy building, producing a lot of energy with quite advanced systems. Maybe this is the future that was in the eyes and in the minds of EU decision makers when they selected this target for the new construction. However, let me render you with this presentation some challenges that we faced in implementing these technologies. What we have at hand is a selection of techniques that are quite common today, but still in everyday construction, not all the clients, not all the builders are willing to adopt them, and the level of everyday building, like average knowledge of these technologies is all the time increasing, but the academic research, of course, runs as it should, several steps ahead of this development. We are learning all the time, new products are coming in all the time, and results are becoming better, but my intention now is to present you some remarks and findings in challenges when applying these technologies in practice. We have wind energy in small scale in built environment, solar energy, solar thermal and photovoltaic panels, where the solar thermal is a more integral part of the systems of a building, but photovoltaic technology, as you know, can be more like add-on, something that you can more easily integrate in existing buildings. And maybe the most difficult part is to find good implementations of wind energy in built environment. The expectations related to photovoltaic energy are, of course, sky high. There are quite high percentages presented of already existing technologies in solar energy and electricity. But what we have today at hand in real building projects is maybe closer to an efficiency of 15%, maximum 18% in system level. And I will show you that in reality, the percentages that we gain in real systems will remain in much more modest level. Never is the theoretical output of photovoltaic panels happening in 100% in practice. There are certain constraints to that. This is a chart from few years behind by NREL that today probably is facing a lot of trouble with the Trump government in US, but otherwise has been very active promoter of renewable energies, and I will get back to this also. In the Finnish environment, the percentages presented to us are not as high as in the diagram by NREL. They talk about up to 45% of efficiency in these technologies. We talk about less than 20% of efficiency, and that would be in optimal conditions. We have these thin film technologies coming into these integrated panels. There's a lot of research and even some experiments with new technologies such as Kretzel cell, but it seems that still today the best economic solutions are found in quite conventional photovoltaic panel technology based on monocrystalline or polycrystalline silicon panels. In climate charts, this is a diagram often presented when we want to say that the potential for solar energy is quite good in Estonia and Finland, but what is not seen in this annual map or this insolation map by NASA is actually that how this solar radiation is divided is not equal within this yellow tone or greenish tone in the previous chart. We get a lot of solar radiation in the summertime and very little in the wintertime. So actually in the north our challenges are bigger, and the demand for cost-efficient battery technologies would be actually even higher in the north. And in here we are not actually in the need of battery systems that help us go over one night, but more like seasonal storaging of electricity. That is the biggest demand, obviously. The Swedish researcher Joakim Widén has rightly pointed out that when we talk about net zero energy, we are talking about calculation which has a lot of uncertainty in it. First of all, the energy output numbers, they are always expectations based on standard years insulation and output that usually doesn't ever come reality. And also the energy consumption of a building changes according to independent households' consumption patterns. This means that the net zero energy balance is actually highly theoretical value and not actually very useful figure to express any kind of environmental performance of building. I will later show you that maybe other kinds of numbers could be more accurate or more useful to describe what is gained with renewable energy in buildings. We did some studies in my practice for the city of Oulu, which is already quite north. That used to be the northernmost school of architecture for a long time, the School of Architecture in Oulu. Now there's one in Luleå, Sweden, but that's quite far north. But still, up there we are still able to show that photovoltaic systems can be profitable solution. And about environmental benefits, I will show you a comparison a bit later. Here we tried to define what is a good output, how we should use the panels in order to gain maximum output of these. And basically, we as architects, as the persons deciding how we integrate these panels, are also defining what is the profitability of these systems and what is the environmental load by these systems. The manufacturing and transportation of these panel systems is the same, but we basically determine what is the output of the system. The very same system can have very good output or much poorer output depending on how we place the panels in urban environment or real environment. This is an example of a daycare center. My office was leading an expert team that created the zero energy daycare building concept for the city of Vantaa, the third biggest city in Finland. And this kind of findings from reality showed why the theoretical output of these systems is actually never coming true. A very small direction change, only -2% of optimal direction already, or 1 degree causes us a loss of 2% of the maximum output. The buildings around it, adjacent buildings, makes us lose 8% of the maximum output. And if we assume that from December to February there will be some kind of snow cover, Even though that's not happening every year, we will lose another 5% of the output. And yet with this calculation, we are on plus side. The output is good enough to be implemented in our climate. This is in south of Finland, where the output is very similar to Tallinn climate. For the city of Oulu, we produced some guidelines for northern climate, what kind of limitations we can in a way accept in the environment, what kind of shading buildings there can be to have economic viability for these systems in buildings, and certain studies of shading of environment were done, and these are today guidelines in the city of Oulu for implementing of these systems. Today, what is coming more and more important is the city-scale analysis of the solar potential, and this can be done, of course, using many tools, but the city model is actually a key tool in this development. And I've learned that in Tallinn, in Estonia, also there's a project going on that aims to produce a model of the whole built environment. And this is just one of the many uses where this kind of model can be used to analyze where the potential is and where it's weaker. This is something that will have an effect on prices of the plots in the future. What is the solar potential of the plot and site? This is a study that we did in Turku, southwest Finland, for a housing company that consists of 4 buildings built in 70s, where we were able to show that from photovoltaic systems on the rooftop, they will basically get cheaper electricity than from the grid, Finnish grid. All these green locations for photovoltaic systems would give them cheaper electricity than what they pay today for the grid electricity. But the challenge in reality is not with these calculations, it's actually that with this purchase of photovoltaic system, you buy 25 years of electricity in one purchase. And to make this happen in reality would actually mean that you want to stay in this building for 25 years, who knows that you want to stay there for that long? Or then there should be economic systems to pass on these single cost, these investments for the future residents of your apartment. These systems today don't exist, and this is of course something that is reducing or kind of preventing these housing companies of doing these investments. Another practical investment bottleneck is that the households have their own electricity agreements with the energy companies. So it's very difficult to allocate the output of the shared system to private agreements with energy companies. Problems are not technical, but still very real. One big promise that still, at least in our market area, is not coming true today, even though the products are there, is building integration. That means that even though we have profitable photovoltaic panels at hand, we can buy them now, and by placing them wisely, we get cheaper electricity than from the grid. We are not using products that would replace a facade material or roofing material, and quite obviously that would improve the economy of that investment. But for some reason this is not happening. This is a big promise that hopefully starts to generate more and more investments in the future, but even the distributors of these technologies confess that for some reason there's no market for these products today. When Finnish investors, when Finnish developers buy these products, they buy them as separate systems, not integrated. And yet there are market areas like this Japanese house by Sekisui House, photographed 15 years ago. It was already at the market at the time, net zero energy building, roof tiles producing photovoltaic energy and providing this building a net zero energy balance over 1 year. When I visited this company, the expectation for sales for this house type for Sekisui House was 10,000 houses. I don't know what's the sales today, but the technology is there, definitely. There are other kind of obstacles that just simply prevent this happening in market. And we've seen very clever integrations of the photovoltaic panels in many pilot buildings, but they are tailored solutions to find products that you could buy for a modern building that today consists of products. There's less and less possibility of tailored solutions in housing production, for example. They are not that many. The most economic solutions are installed today on the flat roof. An important remark for the economy of these systems is that the way these panels are installed is actually quite crucial decision, because that can make the systems too expensive and ruin the economy of the investment. So basically we are searching for solutions where the installation is quite easy, and today that's just installing these panels on the rooftop. Rooftop with weights and not penetrating the waterproof layer at all. With these systems, the economy is quite good, but the dimensioning guidelines in our climate have been missing. In southern Swedish climate, the rule of thumb was that in between these kind of panels, like in the upper image, the distance was 2.5 times the width, the projection width of the panel. In northern climate, it should be more, obviously, as the sun angles are lower. So our recommendations after several simulations was 3.5 to 4 times the width of the panel. This means that on a flat roof, the number of panels is not very wide area, and the output of the whole system is not very big. There's an alternative system to dimension these kind of flat roof systems, and there the guideline is different depending if your panels are in horizontal position or in vertical position. The interesting question of load match has been discussed in many research papers, but today is not still very widely understood among the consumers or even developers of these buildings. This means that even if the annual net balance of energy production and consumption would be 100%, you produce as much as you consume, in reality, the energy comes in wrong time. You don't need it at the time when it comes, and this is, of course, something that happens in the north more than in the south. We have a lot of solar output in the summer season and very little, if any, in the winter season. This study here that described with these arrows was done in Stockholm climate, which is very much like our climate here in Tallinn. It means that even if in annual study the balance is 0, in 10-minute time resolution they only match in under 30% of the time. And what would be the real time frame to use then? This is a load match, so the right time frame would be a blink of an eye immediately. If the electricity from your rooftop doesn't find a place where it's used immediately, it is lost production. That is without batteries. How these studies are today done is usually hourly-based studies, which basically give us a bit distortion in the results. They give us a bit more positive result of the study as the reality is. But to improve this load match, we can do a lot, and I will later show you some examples. My experiences in plus energy building are to some extent from this building, the project that I started at Aalto University. This was the first plus energy building in Finland that we took to take part in Solar Decathlon Europe competition in 2010. We got the first prize in architecture contest and were on the fifth place in general competition. So we were doing quite fine with Finnish products and Finnish know-how, and I believe that with Estonian knowledge we would be already in very successful position over there. The challenge that we wanted to take with our student team that consisted of about 100 students altogether was that we tried to make it plus energy building both in the northern climate and in the southern Spanish climate. And this was quite a challenge. For those who don't know the competition concept, this is something that was started in US. Maybe you know that whenever there's a Democrat president, all renewable energies are highly supported by the government, and at times like this, they are quite the opposite, not supported by the government. I don't know what is today happening with this competition, but the original concept was to collect 20 plus energy buildings on National Mall in front of the White House from university teams to compete for 1 week in not only energy, but in 10 contests. And this is a great learning environment, of course, for university teams to learn about other teams and develop their own concept for plus energy buildings. Our building was here in Spain, and an interesting remark for this area by the riverside in Spain, in Madrid, was that the master plan for this area had to be done in 3D to secure that all the plots have equal access to solar radiation. This is maybe the future in planning here as well. If we want to provide equal opportunities for builders to use solar energy, we have to make studies not only on 2D maps, but in 3D reality. This is our building over there, and these are some competing houses. We can see that the plus energy buildings and integration of photovoltaic panels can have many forms. There's no one fixed form how to do this integration. Some of them are more successful and some of them, of course, less successful. We were going on with quite, not that experimental systems, but still some things we could do with photovoltaic panels. We used panels where the modules are very tightly packed to have maximum output, and we used so-called pyramid glazing to maximize the output of the system. And this is how the energy balance looked in Madrid. You see that in that climate, I think the load match can be much better than in our climate, where the winter season can be easily noticed in here. This is our challenge in plus energy building. This is something that we need to overcome in northern climate, and that's not an easy thing to do. The net zero energy balance is purely a theoretical figure, but if we want to survive with renewable energies these seasons, we have to come up with some new solutions, not only photovoltaics. Maybe it's the batteries, maybe it's something else. This is the final location of the building. In this building, we didn't deal too much with the load match issue. We were just producing as much as possible for the grid. That was one part of the competition, and then purchasing energy from the grid. This is how it works today in Mäntyharju. One finding of this balance was, I was not satisfied with this result, was that the larger is the photovoltaic system, the less it covers from real energy consumption. So this is the load match issue. When you only buy a very small system, you always find the use for the electricity that you produce. But the closer you get to annual net zero energy balance, the bigger is the difference between the real CO2 reduction caused by the fact that you don't need to buy this energy from the grid at all. You get it from your own rooftop. And the investment, which is of course here very high, but this part is something that you cannot use when it comes in the summer afternoons or spring day afternoons, when simply building doesn't have places where to use electricity. This is the pricing, the economic consumption, economic equation of the system. This is what the Finnish market price for this electricity is without any subsidies. And this is what, in this example, a Finnish owner of the building pays for the grid electricity. So-called so-called demand-side management could be an opportunity to engage also architects in this work. This means that we could time the energy consumption to match better with the energy output from the photovoltaic systems. In this simple study, we have a photovoltaic system of 8 panels that's about 12.8 square meters on rooftop. And simply by timing the use of household appliances, we get much better match in load curves, in energy consumption and production. This is a Finnish hourly consumption pattern where you see that the electricity consumption is very much happening in evening time. Then I'm often asked if this really makes environmentally sense to use photovoltaic panels. Don't they make these products they're in China and they have to be transported all the way from there? They have aluminium layers and glass panels and all kinds of components. Yes, they do, but we can compare the CO2 emissions of these products with the grid electricity through LCA-based studies. This is a Swedish study from maybe 6-7 years ago done where they compared the LCA, in LCA study, the photovoltaic output and its CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour then grid electricities in Sweden, Iceland, Finland, Germany, Estonia, Poland, and European average. And there we see quite interesting remark. In Iceland, actually, using photovoltaic panels causes environmental load. It's much better to use grid electricity over there. In Sweden, yes, you maybe gain something by using better photovoltaic panels, but the difference is very small due to the fact that more than half, or about half, of the grid electricity comes from hydropower plants. With the Finnish grid, the electricity that this replaces, you can see that it's already quite beneficial to use this. But it's important to notice that if we, as architects or designers of the built environment, place these panels, we make them face in wrong direction or use angles that are not optimal, this increases, because with the same environmental invest, we get smaller output. So our choices here can actually increase this beam here. Then comparing with Estonia, for example, it's quite easy to see that there's a very good reason to use photovoltaic electricity over here. The grid electricity that it replaces is very CO2 emission intensive. I then wanted to compare this with the newer source of information. This is statistics by Covenant of Mayors created in 2017, and the latest figures are from 2013. Actually, the differences between these country profiles are even increased. So it seems that the reason to invest on photovoltaic panels from environmental perspective is not going anywhere. There's still a very good reason to do it. But interestingly, the Swedish development seems to be going in that direction where the difference is becoming really, really small. If you see a photovoltaic panel in Sweden, it might be, sorry again, wise to tell them that maybe you could save your money and use grid electricity instead, and the environmental benefit would be exactly the same. In solar heat, the efficiencies of the systems are much higher, but for the consumers and developers, these are more complicated systems. This is something that you cannot simply add on. You need to integrate this in your heating system, and especially in the northern climate, this is not very easy. If the real percentages of efficiency in photovoltaic panels are somewhere between 15 and 20, in best cases, in solar heat systems, we go up to 40% in very standard systems. The understanding the potential of solar heat, we tried to put that in this figure in here. You can basically in our climate produce half of your domestic hot water with solar collectors. And if you want to invest on larger domestic hot water storage tank, you can cover also some of the space heating, but 10% would be a safe estimate for that. This is simply because of the mismatch in production and consumption. This is a quite standard solution today. Also, the market is believing already in solar heat systems, so there's nothing exotic, nothing to be tested, but the possibilities of using these potentials and the dimensioning principles could be improved. What we see today often happening is too large solar collector areas. That means that the economy again is ruined. You buy too many collector surface areas, too much surface areas, and then the users of the building are surprised when the benefit doesn't grow linearly, but is limited by the mismatch problem. I was part of this interesting development project quite recently where we think of the solar heat in a bit different way. This is now city being the system, not a plot boundary or building. City and city of Helsinki in this case developing a system of district heating and district cooling, and buildings are now solar collectors. So in this project we were looking at office and residential buildings as big solar collectors taking in too much solar heat, too much in that sense that it needs to be cooled down. But the city system can make use of this excess heat. In heat pump systems, they can be used in other parts of the city. And this, what I found very interesting in here is that cities may be a much better boundary line for these energy studies than a single plot or a building. The whole point why we have cities is that we don't need to survive by ourselves. We don't need to build buildings that, like in the Wild West, were surviving by themselves. The whole idea of building self-sufficient buildings is not working along with the idea of a city. Instead of inventing concepts like passive houses or zero-energy houses, we should ask what kind of building fits to this infrastructure, this city. We tested this idea in new development areas of Helsinki, like Kalasatama area. The buildings indicated in green or yellow were suitable for this concept. And benefits can be seen in here. This is a comparison with standard solution and so-called sunset building, where the cooling demand is increased to some extent, but the savings in heating energy are quite big. And the same thing in residential buildings. We save a lot in heating. At the same time, we need more cooling, but the difference is much, much less. Surprisingly, the study of the whole energy grid in Finland showed that the CO2 reductions are very small. This is because in our heating production system we use CHP. That means that savings in heating energy don't necessarily give us savings in CO2 in electricity production. They are combined together. And we could not actually, in these studies, prove any significant reductions in CO2 emissions. One system of using solar as a heating device is, of course, passive solar, which is not used in our climate at all, even though the potential is there. Even up to the level of Oulu, the potential of saving in heating energy demand could be up to 20–30%. And what we were looking at this study was this curve here. What kind of window and configuration of building could give us a situation where increasing window surface area means less heating energy demand of spaces. And with very high G value and right kind of architectural design, we can have that situation. But this is something that is quite difficult or impossible to find in modern glazing products. On the contrary, the several layers of glass seem to lower the G value than increase. And the skills of architects to produce this kind of buildings are not that good, I would say. In wind turbines, the possibilities of integration are even more limited. This was discussed already this morning in the presentation, but same kind of discussions have been going on in Finland. In Finland, the biggest investments in wind power are being done in Ostrobothnia, in West Coast, where there is already a situation that all the existing investments cover the area so well that you cannot find a place in Ostrobothnia where you wouldn't see at least one windmill working. And they are quite huge structures, of course. In urban scale, integrating of this kind of devices, this is a finished product, is much easier. Until the last year, I held the IPR rights of this kind of innovation that we did about 15 years ago in one project, where we made an off-grid street light using this kind of wind turbine LED lights, some batteries integrated in this pole, a new kind of pole with environmental friendly impregnation. The possibilities to use these kind of lights, for example, in sparsely populated countryside would be quite interesting. But as you can see with this example, the output of this system is quite small. And if you think of this kind of big office building, for example, you could say that in energy balance calculation of this building, these are just decorations. One challenge that we face with wind is that we have a lot of data available about wind conditions, but that's up to a level of 50 meters. And if we want to integrate these systems in built environment, we talk about different heights. We talk about 10 to 20 meters, 25 meters, and this data is not available. There's a good reason for that. City itself is a device that redirects the wind and accelerates the wind speed, slows it down. It's something that we don't have knowledge of today. This also, I hope, will be improved when we have the city models available and can do CFD simulations in an urban environment to understand the pressure differences around the building and the wind conditions in the urban environment. One field of experiment that I've been involved in has to do with CHP, micro CHP, in this case when integrated in built environment. This means combined heat and power. I'm sorry. In these units, basically you produce heat, but also electricity, and in this case using wood chips. There are also smaller systems using wood pellets, and in this case, the opportunity is, of course, to generate electricity on site of renewable energy sources. The great benefit of this Finnish device is that it uses so-called gasification technique. One problem that we have whenever burning wood is the small particle emissions caused by wood burning. And this is quite important health risk, quite a crucial thing to control in this gasification technique that is controlled in 100%. What we get out of this kind of unit is about 8 units of heat and about 3 units of electricity. In this case, it was placed in this residential block in Oulu. This forms one entity where 2 loops of heating connect these buildings to this CHP unit in here. It needs regular refilling of dried wood chips, and availability of these chips is one critical development requirement in practice, that you need to have dried wood chips available. For this reason, we are not able to use this technology, for example, in coastal areas in southwest Finland. And also, the burning of these chips causes low-frequency noise that wasn't in our... We didn't know it before we did this prototype project. So even though this device is underground and surrounded by concrete walls, there's a really low-frequency noise that can cause some disturbance to the residents nearby. However, the CO2 calculation of this system shows quite good results. This is a comparison of the CHP solution with best ground source heat pumps available, district heating and electricity heating. And of course, when we can also have very low emission electricity from on site, the total CO2 emission calculation shows very good results. There is, there's already existing one off-grid entity, off-grid quarter in Finland called Kempele Eco Village that operates with wind power and this kind of micro CHP unit alone. However, this kind of solution has to be something that we already take into consideration when planning the area. We need the space for this kind of unit which is safe for the environment, and this noise is taken into consideration. Also, the heat distribution system has to be based on this kind of loops, because the heat is distributed in quite high temperatures. These are some examples of master plans that could support use of CHP, micro CHP units. This is one of the student projects that I've been doing. This was in Aalto. I was leading the team that took part in the competition in Japan. Our entry was called the 5-tree house, because with wooden pellets from 5 trees per year, we can cover the whole energy demand of the building, both electricity and heating. So we created the story where the family plants every year 5 trees and has kind of a compensation for the energy it uses. This is totally off-grid. And the interesting study for us was to study in the summertime the CHP unit driven by electricity demand, and in the wintertime driven by the heating demand of the building, and finding use for this excess electricity and excess heat. I'm going to concluding remarks now. I'm sorry that my voice seems to be breaking after long flu. My concluding remarks have some things to say to conclude about these experiences. First of all, if we look at these graphs, that's a study that I did at Aalto University with this team. It shows that we have quite high potential of reducing CO2 emissions when choosing rightly the sources of energy The three pillars next to each other show the difference between standard level in energy consumption, bit improved level, and passive house level. There is a difference, but only if the CO2 emissions of the energy source are very high. The big savings, however, happen when we can also impact or have an effect to source of energy that we use. And also regionally, we have different kind of potentials for these choices. I will not go into details because the time is limited, but this is how we see the potentials in Finland. Probably Estonia could be mapped in a similar way. New parameters for these examinations could be the real energy consumption, because that is always a different thing than there's a calculation, the assumption of future energy consumption. This is due to many reasons, but to see this as a parameter is a very important thing. This is a study of single-family houses in Finland based on measured energy consumption and real material choices of these buildings. I will conclude by presenting this Swedish experiment from, some years ago. A voluntary family wanted to live in this experimental building for half a year, trying to reduce their personal CO2 footprint down to 1 ton per person. They didn't quite succeed. They went down to 2.5 tons per person a year. And during 1 week, they were able to go down to 1.5 tons. For me, this is very important study, because this is the climatic target we are facing, not only to reduce the carbon footprint of buildings, but personal carbon footprint. And if we look what the buildings can do to help these families to do this on a voluntary basis, we get to the concepts like smart city. Sharing this information about the everyday choices of everyday life is something that these people need to make these decisions. Also, when asking what kind of buildings would be future-proof, it's difficult to find any good answers. But we can start with the 1 ton CO2 emissions per person. And the buildings, their materials, and energy use in the buildings eats something of this 1 ton. Our target could be that the buildings, the built environment, eats as little as possible of this 1 ton. So the more we have to use for traveling, hobbies, and comforts of life, the better is the situation. These are 2 studies where we wanted to examine if best buildings could be analyzed this way, how much they take off from 1 ton life. Quite little, but still quite big pieces. This kind of examination helps us to see what is the long-term target for the built environment, not only what EU says, but what would be the solid future target to limit the climate warming up to down to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees as it was before. That would already be quite good result. For this, we need new kinds of buildings and a very small CO2 footprint for the buildings, both in materials and in use phase of the life cycle of the building. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kimmo. We don't have too many questions, but one would be that what are the maintenance problems of maybe photovoltaics? How often do you have to clean them? What are the problems with the maintenance things?
I apologize for my voice again. Maintenance is actually quite simple with photovoltaic systems. When we get the systems with batteries, it becomes to be a bit more complicated, but just single add-on photovoltaics are quite simple and straightforward product to have on your rooftop. We have prepared for some building owners guidelines to clean them once a year and take the snow cover off in the end of February. But even without this kind of maintenance, they perform quite well. However, the lifespan of these systems is quite limited. Up to 25 to 30 years is the expected life for the panels. But already in 5 years, there are inverters that need to be replaced. So life cycle of these inverters is much less, and in reality, less than 10 years.
Thank you. And soon we will hear about off-grid solutions. Have you had any experience with off-grid houses, and how is the load match problem covered in these buildings?
That's a very good question. I think that, first of all, the off-grid as a target is not very viable in many cases. Thank you. As I said, cities were kind of developed in order to survive together. And I think the crucial development for future is how the city infrastructure is developed so that within the city boundaries, the energy finds the right places and you don't produce something that is not used anywhere. This is the question for smart cities. But of course, there are situations where you want to, within the plot boundary or the quarter boundary, be off-grid, like on islands or distant locations. Basically, this Oulu block could be, we could run the device so that it's off-grid. But there are certain limitations by legislation, and the maintenance costs would be very high. We would need to run this CHP unit according to that source which is more limited, may it be electricity or heat. So it would always be running with quite high load. And so the technology is there, but the economic reasons don't support building off-grid solutions. And so far, I haven't built any off-grid houses that would be totally independent, with the exceptions of summer cottages where the user of the building voluntarily chooses not to have certain services available, and then, of course, it can run off-grid. But if we assume all the modern comforts and appliances we are used to use, then off-grid becomes quite a difficult target in our climate.
Thank you.